在节目中，我们提到了很多沟通的原则 Core, Minto Principle, Pixar Pitch, and so on. 但今天我想要换一个角度来跟大家谈谈为什么这些沟通的原则这么的重要，那沟通的心态又是什么呢？Hello, 欢迎来到 Executive Plus 主管与沟通力的 Podcast。I'm Sherry, an educator, certified coach, and style enthusiast. 我相信专业有效的沟通是语言跟逻辑的完美结合。
And I'm Nick, a startup consultant, corporate trainer, and late-night gaming junkie. I believe great communication requires the right mindset and solid frameworks.
我们希望带给大家职场英语的技能、跨文化沟通技巧与其他能帮助您成为出色领导者的工具。
Join us each week as we share our experience, research, and methodologies to take your communication and language skills from good to great. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Executive Plus podcast. Now, in the past, we've shared a lot of frameworks, and we've talked a lot about what's the thought process, the logic process behind how you communicate. Today, we want to add another layer to this communication, which is no communication is complete without considering cultural context. Now, luckily, there's a wonderful guide and book on this that we're going to use to cover a lot of aspects of how you bring cultural understanding and nuance into communication.
那我今天想要来介绍一下这本书，这本书的名字叫做 The Culture Map。这本书绝对不是新的书，它是在2016年的时候它就出版了。那这个作者呢，名字叫做 Aaron Meyer。那 Aaron Meyer 他是 INSEAD 这个商学院的一个 professor。那他专门也是到很多的不同的公司去 coach 啊，去做一些 training， 尤其是去针对这种当你必须要 manage 跨文化跟不同国家不同 team 的时候，你该怎么样做的一个 transition。This book, it's introduced by Nick, and you read it a long, long time ago when it first came out.
Yeah,
right?
I actually read it when it first came out, and it first got read by Zona, who then I read it, and then we did quite a bit of training, and then didn't talk about it for a while, but then it came up in one of our conversations, and it really is a great basis for understanding a wide range. A lot of times people will just lump it into Western versus Eastern when it comes to logic, when it comes to thinking patterns. But the reality is there's a lot of dimensions in between, and not everyone matches up. Like, for example, in the UK and US, there are certain things that culturally we don't do the same. Whereas if you take, for example, China and Taiwan, there's a lot of things that culturally are different, even though you may have similar backgrounds historically.
因为我们一直在讲到这种用英语是我们一种国际的语言嘛，我们必须要来做一个 business 的时候一定要用到英语，但是我们还是会碰到各式各样国家的人，你跟法国人做生意，跟德国人做生意，跟美国人做生意是完全不一样的。虽然他们可以用英文去交谈，但是他们也会碰到一些 cultural barrier， 一些 miscommunication。 那今天我觉得如果大家想看这本书，我非常建议，那它的中文名字叫做文化地图。 So this book actually talks about 8 different aspects of communication. So the first is communicating, and we have evaluating, leading, deciding, trusting, disagreeing, scheduling, and persuading.So 我们在之后的订阅制的内容的一些 podcast 当中，我们会再提到更多的细节。那今天我们就来专注于在 communicating 上面，也就是我们在普通做沟通的时候会碰到的一些问题。
Now, communicating is a great place to start for the purpose of our podcast because it's one of the most obvious dimensions that is different between Taiwan and the US especially, or several other Western countries, because it has to do with the high context versus low context. Low context being closer to you say exactly what you mean to say. High context is a lot more nuanced, and they believe that good communication is sort of in the details. We talk about reading between the lines. But most often when we're giving advice about your business English, we're very often taking it from a low context perspective because English is natively used by mostly low context cultures, the US, the UK. And so when we're giving frameworks, English communication frameworks, they're coming from that perspective.
没错，那我们这边稍微解释一下，如果大家对于什么叫做 high context， 什么叫做 low context 有点不太了解的话，high context culture 我们叫做高情境文化，那当然 low context culture means 低情境文化。So think about this. Low context culture 就很像我们刚刚开始交往的 couples， 那 high context culture 就很像是我们结婚20-30年的夫妻。Low context, when you're just started dating, you have to be very explicit about what you want, what you don't want, or else you guys gonna fight a lot, right?
Yeah, when you're first getting to know someone, you're learning their little habits or what they like, what they don't like. You have to be a lot more explicit. Whereas couples who have been together for a very long time, I always joke that the easiest way to see if a couple has been together for a long time is if they play the game Pictionary. Because in Pictionary, you have to like draw something and the other person has to guess immediately. And anytime that you see like a bunch of couples playing Pictionary, whoever has been together the longest or married the longest, they will destroy everybody else because they can just look at each other and know exactly what the other person's
maybe
doing.
they draw a circle and they're just like, oh, I know that movie name.
Yeah, exactly. And the other people are like, what? They're like, yeah, I know. Or in the case of just people that you've worked together for a very long time, Zona and I have worked together now for 7 years. And there will be a lot of times where she'll just look funny. I'd be like, what do you want to say? How do you know? I'd be like, I know that look. Right?
没有错，所以很多在我们这种高情景文化当中，我们不用讲的 explicitly 讲出来，但是就是一点点的一个表情啊，或者是你讲话的 tone 啊不太一样，对方就会了解到。所以我们可以想象在台湾、在中国或在香港这些亚洲，当然日本是最明显的，我们都是在比较 high contact scale， 那在美国啊 UK 它是比较 low contact scale。
Yeah, definitely. And especially you're covering it. Everything is a part of communication, whether it's body language, movement, facial tics, etc. All are very heavily factored in. Whereas a lot of times for low context cultures, it's really just what you say.
Yeah. Mean what you say what you mean.
Exactly.
And this is actually why Nick sometimes when we're not talking about work, when we're outside of work, when we're talking about personal things, and Nick would feel a little confused. How come I'm not...
Confused or annoyed? I think annoyed is...
Annoyed, yes. Annoyed. 他会觉得很烦，就是为什么我讲的跟做的有点不太一样。So I think because for me, I'm partly raised in the States. I grew up partly in the States, but partly here in Taiwan. So 我在工作的时候，我是非常 low context culture. 但是在私人的时候，我是非常 high context. Nick will always tell me, just say what you mean and mean what you say.
Yes. But you see this struggle a lot. Early on, while I was in Taiwan, I would spend a lot of time helping new foreigners who just arrived in Taiwan. And the first 5 years I was here, I was in Chiayi. There's a lot of adjustment for foreigners who come. They don't speak Chinese. They don't really understand the culture. And if you go to Chiayi, like, you're in it. I think in Taipei, you can get away with not really learning Chinese. You can do everything in English. You can get around. But in other cities, that's not possible. And this would cause a lot of people issues because even though, let's say, cram school owners can speak English, they still operate in a very high context way. Meaning, as you said, say what you mean and mean what you say. But we'll talk about feedback in a later dimension. But especially when they want to make suggestions about what they should do, how they should improve, it was very high context. And so they would make some kind of suggestion that the cram school thought was very clear. And the new teacher had no clue what's going on. They'll be like, they didn't tell me to do that. They didn't tell me to, they kind of suggested maybe, but it felt more like a suggestion, not a requirement. But it was actually truly a requirement.
Yeah, and I remember when I was back in New York. 当然在纽约这个地方你会看到各式各样人种的人 And I was in Parsons and we had a group activity where in my group I have someone from Japan, someone from UK, someone from Spain, and of course me. 所以你如果看到这个 skill 的话 by the way 我们会放在讲义上面 So you can go ahead and click onto that. 如果你看到这个 skill你就会发现我们 we're kind of everywhere on this scale, right? 我们从 low context, UK 是比较 low context, Spain 是在中间，然后我们台湾就稍微比较 high context, 像 Japan 是在最极端的地方。
Japan's an extreme.
Exactly. So, oh my God, there were so many arguments among, especially between the British lady and also the Spanish girl in a team, and they would had a lot of arguments, and the Japanese guy would just look so miserable at all times. So that was very interesting. Now I think about it, I'm like, okay, because all of these, we live in a very different culture. So the way we communicate is completely different.
And back to something I talked about earlier is a lot of times people will lump into Asia versus Western. But when you look at the high context, low context scale, you actually find that there's a lot of Western cultures, French, Italian, Spanish, who are actually tend towards high context. They're not as high context as, say, Taiwanese or Japanese, but they're not native English speakers. And again, most of your native English speakers, UK, US, Canada, Australia, are all down low context. But they forget this. And so I can remember one time where I was helping a friend who deals a lot with overseas suppliers. And he kept emailing back and forth with the supplier, and the supplier was in Italy. And he's under the impression that the Italians, Western, should be low context. That's his operating thought process. And the Italian kept on hinting towards things, or like he would ask a question and then my friend would answer the question. And then the Italian would ask another question and then he would answer the question. It got to the point where he got really frustrated. So it's like, why does this person keep asking me very similar questions, but every time I answer him directly and I'm putting my key point at the beginning of my paragraph, etc., does he keep coming back? And then when I read through their entire email chain, it was, again, very nuanced, but the person wasn't directly asking the question that they had a problem with. They were sort of questioning the SOP process of my friend's company. And he didn't trust, like, why is your SOP so, like, for them, it wasn't good enough. But he wasn't going to outright say that. He just kept on questioning, like, well, what happens if this happens? What do you do about this? And it was frustrating my friend. And then we had to go back and be like, okay, he's not asking you these questions. He's trying to figure out his problem. And as soon as my friend came back and said, okay, we're going to modify our SOP a little bit. We're going to fix a few things. It just stopped. The guy was like, oh, okay, we're good.
Yeah. 所以你可能会发现，当你在跟法国人、跟意大利人、跟德国人，他其实跟美国人的那种沟通方式又差蛮多的。他们其实自己之间也会有一些 miscommunication. So, 那今天我们的 takeaway 是什么呢？我们讲了那么多的不同的文化，但我们今天的 takeaway 就是，当你必须要在这种 multicultural or multi-context culture 里面，你要去 managing 不同的 teams， 或者是你要做 presentation, you're going to have a meeting. Like, what is the best way to do in this under the circumstances?
So in the case of multicultural context, and this will be true across several dimensions, is that you tend to go with, in this case, low context because it's clearer. If anyone has taken our conference call class or listened to a lot of our podcasts on that, we always talk about setting agendas, summarizing, going back and asking clarification questions. In this case, the suggestion is go with the low context in a multicultural aspect, simply because then you make sure everything is clear. Now, that's different when you're on a culture to another culture, like a one-on-one situation. You should actually flex and adjust a bit towards their sense of understanding. But in a group setting, going with the low context helps with clarification.
So again, 当你必须要在一个 conference call 或做 presentation 要面对各式各样不同国家的 team 的时候呢， low context is its way to go. Also, 我们一直常提到就是 when you ask a question, ask open-ended question, right? The WH question, because you want to give them more space to explain.
And especially if you're dealing with high context cultures, there's a tendency for them to say, it's okay. But then they're expecting you to read, say, body language, read their tone, and understand that even if they're agreeing, they're not really disagreeing. So if you go with a very simple yes, no, okay, not okay, the answer that you're going to get is not going to be the answer that is true. By asking open-ended questions, you're allowing for discussion and you're allowing more opportunity for people to, say, disagree.
Exactly. And also clarify, and I think Nick mentioned this, clarify when you're not sure. 就不用害怕觉得说自己是不是一直问问题会不会感觉到好像没有礼貌，但是当你有一点点不太了解的话 ask the question, clarify.
So the next piece would be transparency, be clear, and be specific. Especially that last one was specific. When we've talked about, say, in your emails, put the date, put the time, even up in the subject line, this kind of specificity and this kind of clarity becomes really important. So one thing that we've seen a lot of times throughout the pandemic situation is when you're doing an online conference call with multiple cultures, you need to put the time zone. Right? And a lot of people would just assume, okay, if I write the email, you should know that it's in my time zone, or I have to write it's your time zone. You should always just be specific to avoid a lot of this confusion.
Right. And also another thing, when you're expressing what you like or what you don't like about the project, let's say, 你不要就只想说, oh, I don't like it, right? You want to be very specific. Okay, well, maybe I don't really like this because, or this isn't working for me because you give specific example. 所以人家才不会去，比如说他们会想说，诶，你是不是 high context？ 我是不是要去 read between the line？ 或者是 oh, maybe you mean this, oh, maybe you mean that. And then that will cause more confusion, right? So be very specific.
Yeah, and this goes back to that clarification part earlier, which is in a multicultural context, don't read between the lines.
Yeah.
Now, if you're talking to a high context culture in Taiwan, you're used to reading between the lines with other Taiwanese, with Japanese. But in a multicultural, you really should just narrow it down to say what you mean and mean what you say.
Right.
And don't assume something because you may be assuming incorrectly.
And then at the very end of any kind of discussion, make sure you guys recap what you agreed on and what you're going to do next. Like, what are the action steps you're going to take?
Right. And that agreement piece becomes really important because we'll actually talk about agreement as another dimension later. But that in high context cultures, if you don't do that recap, you don't state what you feel you agreed on, you're not allowing that other person to maybe have another shot at either clarifying or disagreeing.
Exactly. And again, don't be extremely polite. 有的时候我们在比较 high context culture 的时候，我们会觉得问太多问题，或者是asking a lot of clarification 这样子会不会不太礼貌？这样会不会让人家觉得很烦？ Again, you want to make sure that you understand and you guys are on the same page.
Right. So a lot of times people will feel, especially coming from high context cultures, that the more questions you ask, maybe the less professional you look. Means like you don't know what you're doing or you're not clear, you weren't paying attention. But the reality is in this multicultural context, it's always better to know, especially when you have a lot of low culture, because low culture will tend to get upset when they're like, well, why didn't you ask? Right?
Exactly. 所以 again, 我们今天最主要是希望大家能够了解，当你在面对非常多不同文化的时候，你该怎么样去 operate 会比较 safe, basically 比较安全。And yeah, so actually a lot of these things all of these things we've talked about, we've mentioned it in our previous podcasts, multiple podcasts, and all the frameworks. So I really hope you guys can enjoy this episode. 那我们在之后在我们的 premium content 我们会有更多的一些 lessons 会在讲这本书其他的 different communication skills.
We'll talk to you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye.
The Executive Plus podcast is a Presentality Group production, produced and hosted by Sherry Fang and Nick Howard. You can search us on Facebook, 主管英文 Executive Plus. You can also find us on Instagram, Communication R&D, and email us at sherry@epstyleplus.com.